Bring in now the former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. She's the author of the new book, Fascism, A Warning. Madam Secretary, great to have you with us always, and especially this morning. As someone who's been on stages like that yesterday, as someone who's sat in rooms with the Russian presidents, as someone who's sat across from adversaries, what were your impressions as you watched that news conference yesterday?
Well, I have to say many impressions, but mostly stunned disbelief at the behavior of the President of the United States in terms of not defending our country and really bending to the kinds of things that Putin really wanted. I think Trump is the gift that keeps giving to Putin.
And Secretary Albright, what do you suspect as you watch that? I mean, you may speculate if you wish or not, but what's going on here? What are we looking at when we see a president not willing to defend the United States and not willing to back up his own intelligence agencies against an adversary like Putin?
I find it very hard to get inside President Trump's mind. I'm not a shrink, but I really do think that there are other things going on in terms of what his desires are, or that he doesn't understand what the responsibilities are of the President of the United States. And what worries me, there are many parts that worry me, but what really does worry me, what went on in that meeting where nobody was.
Right.
I found very interesting in the picture before they go into their private meeting is Putin is sitting there with a pad of paper. I've been with Putin. He takes notes. He is very smart, and there's no idea about what President Trump did in there and what he promised and revealed.
And it's a question, Mike, we've been asking and will continue to ask. Why did President Trump insist on being alone in a room for 2 hours with Vladimir Putin, without his Secretary of State, without his national security advisor, or any of the people you typically see there?
Well, because he was meeting with Vladimir Putin, you can be assured that there's a transcript somewhere, and it's probably in Moscow. But, Madam Secretary, when you were Secretary of State, one of the functions of the Secretary of State is to appear before various Senate and House committees multiple times, and therefore you appear before members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, House Foreign Relations Committee, who are fairly well versed in international affairs. Are you surprised, given what has happened not just yesterday, but repeatedly in lesser volume over the past several months of the Trump presidency, that there has been such muted response or reaction or criticism of what this man, Mr. Trump, is doing to this country's image abroad?
I am surprised that Congress has not reacted more, because they do represent the people. I have to say that those hearings you prepare for, you think about, and you are prepared for some tough questions. And I do think that there needs to be more action by our Congress. Article 1 is about the role of Congress across the board, but especially in foreign policy. And so I do hope that there's more call for explanation by the representatives of the people.
Madeleine Albright, it's great to have you here, Madam Secretary. And let me ask you, what would your advice be to Mike Pompeo today, someone who has spoken out as CIA director against what Russia did in 2016, someone who has spoken out against Russian aggression, and even since then? What advice do you have for him this morning after the President of the United States humiliated himself in front of the world?
Well, it's very hard to advise somebody that doesn't consult, but I think basically it is important for them to understand, all the people that work for President Trump, what their responsibilities are. But I do think that people need to recognize that they took an oath of office themselves to protect the Constitution, and I think everybody has to make up their own minds about how they're going to react. But I do think I can't visualize what the meetings must be like after something like this. Does anybody say to him, to the president, what in God's name were you thinking about when you did that? Because somebody needs to make it clear to President Trump that his behavior in that press conference was un-American, outrageous, ridiculous, stupid. I can't even think of all the adjectives that I think really should be attributed to that behavior.
Madam Secretary, it's Richard Haas here. Good morning. What would you now say that the President of the United States or the U.S. government more broadly, should say to Mr. Putin? What should we do? What do you think we should be doing both in retaliation against Russian interference, and what ideally do you think we should basically threaten Mr. Putin with in order to deter future interference in our politics?
Well, I do think, first of all, I do think that there should be conversations with the Russians. I think even in the worst circumstances, diplomacy is important, and to have those conversations at a variety of different levels. I think that our best tool at the moment continue to be sanctions, and I think that we need to make clear that not only are the ones that are on will stay on, but there might be some tougher ones given some of the things that Mr. Mueller came up with, and to keep the pressure on. And I think that we do need to have more outpouring of outrage by members of Congress on this, and just generally talking about the fact that we need to keep the pressure on the Russians, but not to say that we'll never talk to them. That's ridiculous. I have been in many tough meetings, and I was with Putin, and I think one has to push back, not just agree, oh, you're so smart and thank you so much for helping, and a variety of things that are unacceptable for an American president to say ever, especially on foreign soil, standing next to the man that in fact has undermined our electoral process. Should
we try to weaken Putin's internal position? Should we be, in a sense, willing to play fire with fire and use cyber tools to try to influence Russian politics?
I think we need to figure out generally how we operate in the cyber field. But we do need to understand, as some of you have already said, is that Putin is a KGB agent. He is better at propaganda than anybody. And also at lying. And I think that the important part is for us to look at what tools we have and try to figure out how to explain why democracy works and why you don't congratulate somebody that has won an election without an opponent that can have any voice to speak. And I think we need to talk about the importance of the press and not agree that the press is the enemy of the people.
Madam Secretary, it's Catty Kay here. I've had diplomats over the course of the last few days suggesting to me that the transatlantic alliance and relationship can survive 4 years of Donald Trump, but probably not 8 years. In the context of what happened yesterday with Vladimir Putin, where does this leave Europe now? What should European countries be doing to fortify their own securities? The Germans have suggested we can't rely on America anymore.
Well, I think it's a tragedy when our allies say they can't rely on us. And I have obviously spent a lot of time in Europe generally and just before all this took place, and I think our allies had trouble explaining what was going on before. I do think that it is possible for the Europeans to have a strong European defense and try to sort out what the EU should be doing, but I don't think they should give up on America. I think that there are a number of ways that those of us that have been involved in this before need to keep restating that we are an alliance that generally in terms of our values, that we need to continue to work together, and that we are all resilient and we will get over this. But we cannot normalize the behavior of President Trump. I thank you for mentioning my book, Joe, and I really do think that I have said that it is a warning that one of the things, the best quote in my book is from Mussolini, who said, if you pluck the chicken one feather at a time, nobody will notice. We have just plucked a lot of feathers here. And I think that it's very important for us to make clear that Trump has overplucked and that we need to make very clear what is going on.
Well, and Madam Secretary, obviously your personal experiences in your life being driven out of Europe, Dr. Brzezinski's and Mrs. Brzezinski's experiences, two close friends of yours throughout their entire lives, put so much of this into sharp relief, especially considering that you and Dr. Brzezinski spent your adult lives fighting against the spread of Russian influence in Central and Eastern Europe. That must put comments like yesterday in even more stark relief.
No question, because I do think that Putin has a plan. He wants to undermine democracy. He wants to separate us from our allies in Europe. He wants to reassert influence in the Middle East. And our president is a help in all of this. There is a term that the Russians use. It's called useful idiot. I do think that whatever President Trump thought he was saying, he definitely helped Putin's plans for getting back into the game and for undermining democracy in Europe. We cannot allow that to happen.
Madam Secretary, thank you for being with us. Mika sends her best and is reading halfway through your book, Fascism, A Warning, by Madeleine Albright. Thank you so much, Madam Secretary.
Thank you. Give her my best.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.